Chapter 3. Edward's dark eyes grew wide with fear. He grasped Susanna's hands tightly. They listened, frozen together in the dark woods as if they'd been turned to stone. The voices rose, carried by the wind, chanting voices. "Burn the witch! Burn the witch! Burn the witch!" "Oh," Susanna gasped. The chanting voices weren't coming from nearby. The wind was carrying the sound from the commons. "There is no one here," Edward said, smiling with relief. "Poor Abigail Hopping," Susanna whispered. "If she is a witch, she must face the fire," Edward replied, still holding Susanna's hand. Susanna rested her head against his shoulder. "We should get back. I went out for firewood. I should have been home. My mother will think the evil one has taken me." "You go first," he told her. "I will wait here a while before I return." "Are you going to tell your father about us?" Susanna asked eagerly. "Yes," Edward told her, "when the time is right." She leaned forward and kissed him again. She didn't want to leave. She didn't want to go back to her tiny dark house. She didn't want to return to all the anger and fear of the village. Edward gave her a gentle push, his hands on her shoulders. "Go." She forced a smile, then turned and ran off, pulling on a cap and covering her hair. "We're going to be married," she thought, her heart pounding. "Edward and I are going to be married. I am going to be the wife of Edward Fear." She felt as if she were floating through the trees. Susanna ran right past the woodpile and through the commons, and was nearly home before she remembered she had come out for firewood and had to go back. "The carrots are small but sweet," William Good said. He sat stiffly at the head of the table, rubbing gravy off the wooden plate with a biscuit. Susanna watched her father eat his dinner. He looked tired to her, tired and old. He was not yet 40, yet his face was lined, and his once blonde hair had turned prematurely white. "Susanna baked the biscuits," Martha Good said. "Would you like more gravy, father?" Susanna asked, gesturing to the gravy pot still simmering on a hearth. "There are more boiled carrots, too." "I am going to mash some carrots and give them to George when he wakes up," Susanna's mother said. "I do not know why our carrots are so small," Mr. Good grumbled. "Matthew Fear's carrots are as long as candles." "Why do you not ask him his secret?" Susanna's mother suggested. William Good scowled. He narrowed his gray-green eyes at his wife. "Matthew Fear has no farming skills that I do not have. He has no secrets that I—" "The Fears have plenty of secrets," his wife interrupted. "Who are they, these Fear brothers? Where did they come from? They did not come to the New World from England as we did." "I do not know," Mr. Good replied thoughtfully. "They come from a small farm village. That is all I know. They were poor when they arrived, both Fear brothers and their wives, but they have prospered here, and that proves they are pious folk, favored by the Maker." His wife sighed. "These carrots are sweet enough, William. I did not intend to hurt your feelings." William Good frowned. "Sweet enough," he muttered. "Help me clear the dinner table, Susanna," Martha Good ordered. "Why are you sitting there with that dazed, faraway expression on your face?" "Sorry, Mother." Susanna started to get up, but her father placed a hand on her arm to restrain her. "Susanna will clear the table in a little while," he told his wife. "I wish to speak with her first." He stood up, pulled a clay pipe down from his pipe rack, filled it with tobacco from his cloth pouch, and went over to the fire to light it. Susanna turned in her chair, her eyes trained on her father, trying to read his expression. "What do you wish to speak to me about, father?" "About Edward Fear," he replied, frowning as he puffed hard to start the tobacco burning. Susanna gasped. She had never discussed Edward with either of her parents. She and Edward were merely acquaintances as far as her parents knew. Holding the long white pipe by the bowl, Mr. Good made his way back to the dinner table. He pulled back the stool next to Susanna's and sat down stiffly. "What about him?" Susanna stammered, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. Her father leaned close to her. Pipe smoke rose up in front of him, encircling them both in a fragrant cloud. "You and Edward Fear have been seen walking together," he accused, "walking together, without a chaperone present." Susanna's mouth dropped open. She took a deep breath, then started to speak, but no sound came out. "Do you deny it, daughter?" Her father's white eyebrows arched over his gray-green eyes, which burned accusations into hers. "Do you deny it?" "No, father," Susanna replied softly. "You were seen in the woods together," her father continued sternly. He held the pipe close to his face but didn't smoke it. "Yes, father," Susanna muttered, her heart thudding in her chest. Then the words just burst out of her. She had been longing to tell her parents. Now she could hold back the news no longer. "Edward and I are in love," she cried. "He wants to marry me. Is that not wonderful?" Her mother turned from the hearth, her eyes wide with surprise. William Good's face reddened. He lowered his pipe to the table. "Daughter, have you lost your senses? Are you living in a world of dreams?" Susanna gaped at him. "Didn't you hear me, father? Edward wants to marry me." Her father shut his eyes. He cleared his throat loudly. The pipe trembled in his hand. "You cannot marry Edward Fear," he said quietly. "What are you saying?" Susanna whispered. "Why can't I?" "Because Edward Fear is already betrothed," Mr. Good replied flatly. Susanna gasped. "What?" "Edward Fear is engaged to be married," her father said. "Edward is to marry a young woman of Portsmouth. Her father told me this morning." Chapter 4. The hearth fire flickered low. Long shadows slipped across the floor. In her sleeping alcove, huddled under an old feather quilt, Susanna turned her face to the wall. How could Edward be so cruel, she asked herself for the 1000th time. How could he lead me to believe that he cared for me, that he loved me? Susanna pressed her face into the pillow to muffle her sobs. She had gone to bed early, hoping her parents wouldn't see how upset she was. Hours had passed now. A pale half-moon was high in the late-night sky, and Susanna was still wide awake, still tossing in her narrow bed, crying softly and thinking about Edward with anger and disbelief. I trusted Edward, she thought. I believed everything he said. I risked my reputation for him. And all the while he was engaged to another girl. Breathing hard, Susanna rolled over and stared at the glowing embers in the fireplace across the room. Her secret meetings with Edward Fear rolled through her mind. She remembered his words, his touch, his kisses. Edward always seemed trustworthy, she thought miserably. So honest and upright, so good. Susanna kicked off the quilt and pushed at the pillow, punching it with both hands. I will never trust anyone again, she told herself bitterly. Never! Across the commons, firelight blazed in the windows of Benjamin Fear's 2-story house. In the dining room, Benjamin was standing at one end of the oak table, gripping the back of a hand-carved chair. Benjamin's son Edward glared at him defiantly from the other end of the table. Benjamin was big and broad-shouldered, an imposing man who looked as if he could wrestle a bull and win. He had straight black hair that fell below his ears, and bushy black eyebrows over small dark eyes that seemed to be able to pierce through anything. Benjamin's face was red and almost always set in a hard frown. He was so powerful in appearance, his expression so angry, that most people in Wickham were afraid of him, which didn't displease him in the least. Standing with his back to the fire, Benjamin unfastened the long row of brass buttons down the front of his black doublet, his dark eyes studying Edward. "I will not obey you, father," Edward insisted, his voice trembling. He had never defied his father. He knew it was wrong. Benjamin stared across the table, his features set. He didn't reply. "I cannot obey you, father," Edward said, when his father did not reply. "I will not marry Anne Ward." Edward gripped the back of the chair. He hoped his father could not see his trembling knees. "You will marry the girl in the autumn," Benjamin said in his deep baritone. "I have arranged the marriage with her father." He turned away from Edward to indicate that the discussion had ended. Picking up a poker, he jabbed at the logs in the fireplace, sending a shower of sparks flying up the brick chimney. Edward swallowed hard. "Can I do this?" he asked himself. "Can I stand up to my father? Am I strong enough?" Another question nagged at Edward as he struggled to find words. Is it right to argue with my father? Is it not my duty to obey his wishes? No, Edward answered his own question. I love Susanna Good. I will marry Susanna and no one else. I cannot obey my father's wishes this time. I will not. Edward took a deep breath. Sir, he called, causing Benjamin to turn away from the fire. I cannot marry Anne Ward. I do not know her. She is a stranger. You will become acquainted with her after the wedding, Benjamin said sternly. It is a very fortunate arrangement for us. It is not fortunate for me, Edward declared heatedly. Do not raise your voice to me, Edward, Benjamin warned, his face a dark crimson. He raised the fireplace poker and pointed it at his son. Anne Ward is an excellent match for you. But I do not know her, father. I do not love her, Edward cried shrilly. Love? Benjamin tossed his head back and laughed. Edward, we did not come to these colonies for love. My brother, Matthew, and I did not leave our village for love. We came here to succeed. We came here to escape the poverty of our lives, to escape it forever." "I know, father," Edward said, sighing, "but—" "Do you know how poor our family was in the old country?" Benjamin demanded, setting down the heavy iron poker and returning to the table. His eyes burned into Edward's, hotter than the fireplace flames. "Do you know how poor Matthew and I were? We ate rats to survive, Edward." "I know, sir," Edward tried to interrupt. He had heard this speech before. "Many was the night we huddled together to keep warm," Benjamin continued. "We had no fire, no blankets." Edward lowered his gaze to the floor. He held his breath, waiting for his chance to speak. "We came to the New World to succeed, Edward. Not just to succeed, but to prosper." "You have done well, sir," Edward broke in. "You are the respected magistrate of Wickham, and Uncle Matthew's farm is the most—" "We can do better," Benjamin exploded, slamming his fist on the tabletop. "Your marriage to Anne Ward will help us do better, Edward." "Why, father? I don't see—" "August Ward is a tea importer for Portsmouth," Benjamin explained, lowering his voice. "It has made him a very wealthy man. As his son-in-law, you will become a tea importer, too. You will share his wealth." "No, father," Edward shook his head. "I cannot. I will not." "You will," his father insisted sternly. "You must. You must marry August Ward's daughter." "I cannot, father. I am in love with someone else." The words burst out of Edward's mouth before he could stop them. He gasped, realizing what he had just revealed. For a brief moment, Benjamin's eyes widened with surprise. Then his expression quickly darkened. "In love?" he asked, his voice rising sarcastically. "With whom?" He made his way down the long table to confront his son. "With whom?" he demanded again, bringing his face a few inches from Edward's. "Susanna Good," Edward replied weakly. He cleared his throat and tried to avoid his father's harsh stare. Benjamin hesitated, stunned. Then he closed his eyes and began to laugh, scornful laughter. "Do not laugh, sir," Edward stammered. "I am in love with Susanna Good, and I wish to marry her." Benjamin Fear shook his head, his smile lingering. "William Good owns 2 scrawny chickens and 2 cows. His daughter is not a match for you, my son." Edward took a deep breath, trying to calm his pounding heart. In his 17 years, he had never argued with his father, never dared to disagree with him. "Please," he prayed silently, "give me the strength to stand up to my father now. I know I am right. I know I cannot betray Susanna. Please give me the strength." "Sir," Edward began, "Susanna is a pious girl. She is the girl I will marry. I cannot marry a girl for her wealth. I must marry for love." Benjamin closed his eyes. A log cracked loudly in the fireplace. The floorboards creaked as Benjamin shifted his weight. He sighed wearily. "Your engagement to Anne Ward is arranged. We will travel to Portsmouth in the autumn for your wedding. I wish your mother, Margaret, bless her soul, were alive to see you wed so profitably." "No!" Edward cried. "No, father!" He could feel his anger rise, feel the heat of it in his chest, feel himself losing control, for the first time in his life. "I have always obeyed you, sir. I know you are a wise and honorable man, but it is my life," Edward screamed, his hands balled into tight fists at his waist. "It is my life, and I will marry Susanna Good. I will marry her even if we have to run away to do it." Edward turned from his father and ran from the room. "I did it," he thought, relief mixing with his anger as he made his way to his bedroom. "I said what I had to say. I stood up to my father." Back in the narrow dining room, Benjamin Fear slumped heavily into a chair. He fingered the shiny buttons on his doublet as he stared thoughtfully into the fire. Before long, a dark smile spread over the man's ruddy face. "I am sorry, Edward, my poor confused son," he said, grinning into the leaping flames. "You will never marry Susanna Good." Chapter 5. "I dislike peeling potatoes," Susanna groaned. Her mother, seated in front of the hearth with the baby on her lap, raised her eyes to Susanna, her features tight with concern. "Are you feeling well, daughter? It isn't your nature to complain." "I am feeling well," Susanna replied, sighing. "I shall never feel well again," she thought miserably. Never, never, never. She wanted to tell her mother everything, tell her about Edward and how he had lied to her, how he had betrayed her. But Susanna knew she had to keep her broken heart a secret. Her meetings with Edward were against all rules of conduct. Susanna had sinned, and now she was paying for her sins, paying with an empty feeling that gnawed at her without relief. paying with a heavy sadness she knew she'd never shake. Martha Good rose from her chair, cradling the sleeping baby in one arm, and stepped up behind Susanna at the table. She put her free hand to Susanna's forehead. You feel a little warm, daughter. Do you feel feverish? Susanna lowered her knife and gazed up at her mother. I am not ill, she said impatiently. I just detest peeling potatoes. They are so wet and slippery. Martha Good took a step back, startled by Susanna's vehemence. We should all be thankful that we haven't given potatoes for our meal, she said softly. Your father worked so hard, Susanna. It is a sin to complain if there is food on the table. Yes, mother, Susanna relented, lowering her eyes. Edward's face flashed into her mind, his thick brown hair, his dark eyes. Where are you now, Edward? Susanna wondered, picking up another potato to peel. What are you doing? I know you are not thinking about me. Are you thinking about your bride? Are you packing your bags, preparing your journey to Portsmouth? She uttered a long sigh and stabbed the knife into the potato. Susanna, are you sure you are not ill? Her mother demanded. No, not ill, Susanna muttered, unable to shake Edward from her mind. The potatoes can wait, her mother said, returning to the hearthside chair and carefully lowering the baby onto her lap. It is a beautiful afternoon. Put on your cap and step outside. Breathe some fresh air. It will refresh you, daughter. I do not feel like breathing fresh air, Susanna snapped. I might see Edward, she thought, her heart skipping a beat at the idea. And what would I do if I saw him again? What would I say? She could feel her face redden in shame. I was such a fool. Struggling to hold back the tears, Susanna picked up another potato. The door burst open without warning. Susanna and her mother both cried out in surprise as two village men stepped into the room, grim expressions on their faces. What? Martha Good started, but her voice caught in her throat. The baby opened his eyes and gazed up at her, startled. The two men stepped to the center of the room, revealing Benjamin Fear in the open doorway. My husband is not home, Martha Good told the two officers. I believe he is at the Commons. The two men stood stiffly, their expressions set, as Benjamin Fear strode into the room. His black boots clonked heavily on the floorboards, his face red beneath his tall black hat. We are not here for your husband, Martha Good, he said coldly in his booming baritone. I do not understand, she replied, alarm creeping into her voice. The baby uttered a squawk, preparing to cry. Martha Good pulled him close to her chest. What business have you with me, Magistrate Fear? She asked, climbing reluctantly to her feet. Benjamin Fear ignored her question. Keep watch on them, he instructed the two men. I will search for the proof. Proof? Proof? Proof of what? Susanna cried, tossing down her knife and jumping to her feet. Why are you here? Why can you not wait for my father to return? Benjamin ignored Susanna, too. He strode quickly to the hearth, his black cloak sweeping behind him. Aha! He bent down, as if picking up something from behind a kettle. When he turned around to face them, Benjamin held a purple cloth in one hand. His lips spread into an unpleasant smile. I believe we have the proof we need. Proof of what? Susanna demanded shrilly. Benjamin walked quickly to the table and overturned the bag, spilling its contents onto the tabletop. To her astonishment, Susanna saw a chicken's foot, some feathers, dried roots of some kind, a small bone, and a glass vial containing a blood-colored liquid. What is that? Susanna cried. That does not belong to us, her mother cried, her face pale, her troubled eyes darting from the items on the table to Benjamin Fear. We have the proof we need, Benjamin told his men, holding up the empty bag. He gestured to Susanna and her mother. Take them to the prison. Tie them securely to await their trial. Trial? Martha Good shrieked, holding her baby tightly against her chest. Trial for what? For the crime of witchcraft, Benjamin Fear declared, eyeing Susanna coldly. The two officers moved quickly, grabbing Susanna and her mother firmly by the shoulders. Benjamin strode quickly to the door, still gripping the empty purple bag. Benjamin Fear, you know us, Martha Good cried desperately. You know we are a God-fearing, humble, and pious family. You cannot do this, Susanna shrieked, fear choking her throat. You cannot do this to us. The officers dragged Susanna and her mother to the door. The baby whimpered in confused fear, one tiny pink hand breaking free of his mother's grasp and thrashing the air wildly. As Susanna and her mother were pulled out the door, Benjamin Fear stepped back to watch. His eyes gazed hard at Martha Good, then lingered for a while on Susanna. He didn't smile. His face was set in rigid coldness. But Susanna thought she caught a gleam of merriment in his dark eyes. Just then their neighbor, Mary Halsey, attracted by the commotion, appeared at their door. "Please, take the child," Martha pleaded, and handed the baby to Mary. "Keep him safe." The baby's whimpers turned to frightened cries. As the two men dragged Susanna and her mother away, Benjamin Fear followed close behind, his eyes on Susanna all the while. This is not happening, Susanna thought, her heart pounding, the blood pulsing at her temples. This cannot be happening to us. She heard surprised murmurs as they passed through the commons, whispered questions, muffled cries of surprise. The prison loomed ahead, a low clapboard building behind the meeting house. "Why are you doing this to us?" Susanna cried, the words bursting from her throat. "Why are you dragging us from our home?" Benjamin Fear stopped on the path. His voice was low and steady. His eyes locked onto Susanna's. "You two witches will burn before the week is out," he said. Chapter 6. Torches were hung on the meeting house walls. Their flames flickered and threatened to go out every time the door was pulled open, allowing a gust of wind into the hot room. In the prisoner's box at the front of the court, Susanna gripped her mother's hand and stared at the flames. Her mother's hand felt so small, like that of a cold, frightened animal. Without realizing it, Susanna had nervously started chewing her lower lip. Now she felt the bitter taste of blood in her mouth. "They burn witches," she thought, staring at the torchlight. "They've burned 3 already." Her entire body convulsed in a shudder of fear. She squeezed her mother's hand tighter. Even though witches in other parts of Massachusetts colony were hanged, Benjamin Fear believed that burning was the only way to punish a witch. "But I am not a witch. Surely, if there is justice in Wickham, I will not be found guilty." The long, low-ceilinged room was filled with shadows. Solemn faces flickered in the orange torchlight. Eyes, dozens of eyes, peered at Susanna and her mother. The rows of wooden benches stretched to the back of the long room. People crowded quietly into them, the frightened citizens of the town, whispering their fears, staring at Susanna and her mother with curiosity and surprise and pity. The whispers and hushed voices grew louder, until Susanna wanted to cover her ears. "Mother, why do they stare at us like that?" she uttered in a frightened voice, leaning so close she could feel her mother's trembling. "They know us. They know who we are." "Some believe they are staring into the faces of evil," Martha Good replied, squeezing her daughter's hand. "But they know us," Susanna repeated shrilly, her heart thudding in her chest. "Our innocence will soon free us," her mother replied softly. Her words were brave, but her entire body shook with fear. "Edward, where are you?" Susanna wondered. "Have you spoken to your father? Have you told him about us?" "Edward will not let us burn," Susanna said out loud without realizing it. Her mother stared at her in surprise. "What did you say?" Susanna started to reply, but someone in a front bench cried out loudly. Susanna heard a flapping sound and felt a cold ripple of wind close to her ear. Startled voices called out. Susanna heard the flapping again, like the beating of wings. A shadowy form darted overhead. "A bat!" a man shouted from the back of the room. The creature swooped low toward the flickering light of a torch, then flew over the prisoner's box again, its wings beating like a frightened heart. Matthew Fear appeared at the front of the room. "Open the doors, let it out," he ordered. The bat swung low over the spectators, and Susanna saw several heads duck. She felt a cool ripple of air as the bat flew past her face. "Hold open the doors, it will fly out," Matthew Fear said, in his high-pitched voice. The doors were obediently pulled open. The torches flickered and bent in the invading breeze. A moment later the bat swooped out, disappearing into the starless sky. The doors were closed. Matthew Fear shouted over the buzz of voices, calling for silence. He served as trial warden, keeping order during his brother's trial proceedings. He did not have Benjamin's booming, deep voice. He was not as large or imposing as his brother, but he had the same fire of ambition in his dark eyes. The room grew silent. The shuffling of feet made the floorboards creak. Someone near the doors coughed loudly. Matthew turned to the prisoners, adjusting the white stock he wore over his robe. "You may summon as many evil creatures as you wish," he told Susanna and her mother, his eyes glowing like dark coals. "You may summon bats or snakes, or the evil one himself, but it will only serve to prove your guilt." "We did not summon that bat," Susanna cried. "Silence!" Matthew ordered. "Silence! A dark creature like that would not enter our court unless summoned. Loud murmurs burst forth from the rows of benches. Accusing eyes, reflecting the torchlight, glared at Susanna and her mother. Silence! Silence! Matthew shouted, gesturing with both hands. As the room grew quiet, Susanna saw a man at the end of a row rise to his feet. Release my wife and daughter, he demanded. It is father, Susanna cried to her mother, leaning forward to see him better. Release them, Matthew Fear. You know they are not witches, Mr. Good cried passionately. A tall man in dark robes strode to the front of the room and stood beside Matthew Fear. Be seated, William Good, Benjamin Fear ordered. We do not place innocent women on trial here. But they are innocent, William declared. I swear it by all that is holy. Be seated, Benjamin commanded in his booming voice. Be seated, William, or I will remove you from this court. Susanna saw her father open his mouth to protest, but he uttered only a helpless groan before slumping onto his seat. Benjamin Fear turned to face the accused. His straight black hair and dark eyes glowed almost red in the torchlight. Martha Good, do you wish to confess your guilt? He asked, leaning close to the prisoner's box. Susanna's mother cleared her throat. Her voice came out in a choked whisper. I have no guilt to confess. Sneering, Benjamin turned his harsh gaze on Susanna. Susanna Good, do you wish to confess your guilt? Susanna clasped her trembling hands tightly in her lap and lowered her head, a couple of blonde ringlets falling loosely from her cap over her face. I am not a witch, she managed to utter. Edward, where are you? Edward, aren't you going to save us? Isn't anyone going to save us? Confess now, Benjamin demanded. There are witnesses in this hall tonight. Witnesses who saw you both dancing with the evil one in the moonlit woods. That is not true, Susanna shrieked, on her feet now. Susanna! She could hear her mother's warning, feel her mother's touch on her sleeve. That is not true, Susanna repeated. We have never... Be silent, witch, Matthew Fear commanded, stepping up beside his brother, a fierce scowl on his slender face. You have already tried to bedevil us by summoning that creature of the night into our meeting hall. Do not disrupt the trial again. Confess now. Your hollow protests only serve to demonstrate your guilt. But we are innocent, Susanna shrieked. Release them. Release them now, Susanna heard her father cry. Low murmurs spread through the long rows of benches, growing to a roar. Release my innocent wife and child, William Good cried desperately. My son needs his mother. Matthew turned to point to Susanna's father, who stood with his hat gripped tightly in one hand. Remove him from the hall, he shouted angrily. Suddenly, John Halsey, Mary Halsey's husband, stood in the back of the meeting house. Let him speak, Matthew. You've known the Good family for years, he cried. Release my family, William insisted. This trial is a mistake, a mockery. Remove him, Matthew ordered, silencing John Halsey. From out of the shadows, 2 militia officers moved quickly, pushing their way into William's row, grabbing him by the shoulders. Staring over the startled, silent faces of the onlookers, Susanna saw her father struggle. She heard angry shouts, scuffling, a hard blow, followed by her father's cry of pain. A few moments later, she could see her father's limp body being dragged up the aisle. The doors at the back were flung open. The sudden breeze threatened to extinguish the torches against the walls. The flames dipped low. The darkness deepened, then the flames rose up again. The room returned to heavy silence. Her father had been taken out. You cannot save us, father, Susanna thought, cold dread tightening her throat. You cannot save us, so who will? Will it be you, Edward? Are you here? Will you speak to your father? Will you rescue us from the fire? Or will you betray me again? We have all witnessed their dark powers, Benjamin Fear announced to the rows of onlookers. We have seen them try to darken this hall just now. The torches nearly went out, but our goodness prevailed over their evil power. He turns to Susanna and her mother. Your evil could not douse our torches. Your evil could not put out the light of truth in this room. It was the wind that nearly doused the torches, Susanna cried. Silence, witch, Benjamin screamed, his booming voice ringing off the dark wood walls. He raised one hand high above his head. Susanna saw that his hand was gripping the purple bag, bulging with its odd assortment of items. I found the proof of your blasphemy, Benjamin declared. I myself found the tools of your witchcraft. I found this near your hearth, a hearth made cold by the presence of the evil one. It does not belong to us, Susanna screamed, feeling her mother's restraining hand on her sleeve once again. "Silence!" Benjamin warned, his dark eyes narrowing at Susanna. "We have the proof of your evil practices," Benjamin continued. "We have witnesses who have seen your moonlight dance with the evil one and his servants, and we have seen your attempts to frighten us tonight by bringing a bat into our meeting hall and trying to douse our light." "No!" Susanna shrieked, tugging at the sides of her hair with both hands. "No, no!" "Good shall always triumph," Benjamin continued, ignoring Susanna's shrill cries of protest. "Good shall always triumph over the evil one. Those of us with pure hearts shall always triumph over your kind, Martha and Susanna Good." Susanna's mother lowered her head, but Susanna could see her shoulders trembling and knew her mother was crying. Susanna wanted to scream out her protest, to declare her innocence until Benjamin Fear would listen to her, but she could see that her shouts were of no use. Her heart pounding, her head spinning, Susanna slumped over and leaned her head against her mother's trembling shoulder. "A dark evil has descended on Wickham," Benjamin Fear was saying. "As magistrate, it is my duty to battle it wherever it may appear." He faced the onlookers and lowered his voice as he spoke to them. "It is not my desire to put on trial the wives and daughters of our village, but it is my sacred duty to protect all who are innocent from those possessed by the evil one, such as these." He pointed to Susanna and her mother. "There is nothing left but for you to confess," he demanded, stepping up before the prisoner's box. "Do you confess, Martha Good? Do you confess to your evil practices?" Susanna's mother was crying too hard to reply, her shoulders heaving, her face turned away into the shadows. "Do you confess to practicing the dark arts, Susanna Good?" Benjamin demanded. "I am innocent," Susanna uttered in a choked whisper. "Your refusal to confess," Benjamin shouted, "your unwillingness to confess to the truth proves your guilt." He stood over Susanna and her mother, leaning close, so close that Susanna could smell his sour breath. "We have found you, Martha Good, and you, Susanna Good, guilty of witchcraft. It is my duty as magistrate to sentence you both." "No, please!" Susanna shrieked, reaching out to him. He backed away, eyeing her coldly, his face half hidden in shadow. "You shall both burn tomorrow night," Benjamin announced, without any emotion at all. A pale half-moon, poking through wisps of dark cloud, cast a faint rectangle of light through the tiny window of the prison cell. Susanna leaned against the cold wall and stared down at the patch of light on the dirt floor. Her hands were tied behind her, so she could do no witchery, the warden at the jail had told her. Martha Good lay in darkness against the opposite wall. Breathing hard, uttering low moans, calling out for her baby, she slept fitfully. Too frightened and upset to sleep, Susanna suddenly saw a shadow making its way up the front of her skirt, a spider. She bent toward it, struggling to free her hands, but they were fastened tightly. She could not brush the spider away. She could only stare at it helplessly as it made its way up her dress. Outside, the white moonlight fell on two large mounds of straw, golden under the pale wash of light. "Is this the straw we will burn in?" Susanna thought with a shudder. "Are these mounds of straw waiting to be our final bed?" The spider was up to her waist, its legs moving quickly over the coarse fabric of the dress. As she stared at the mounds of straw and pictured them afire, a strangled sob burst from her throat. She turned her eyes from the window. "I am not a witch," she thought with fierce bitterness. "My mother is not a witch. What of the three they have already burned? Were they innocent too? Are the innocent burning in Wickham? Can that be true?" Suddenly the moonlight appeared to be snuffed out. The tiny cell was cast in deep darkness. Startled, Susanna turned to see a silhouette on the other side of the window, blocking the light. Who's there?" she stammered. "Susanna," came a hoarse whisper. "Edward!" she cried, feeling a burst of joy lighten her chest. "Edward! Have you come to save us?"